afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Marin Coalition. My name is Scott Pinsky, the chair, and we're pleased to see you all here. For anyone who is new to our organization, we are a public speaking organization that's been here in Marin for over 50 years, and we present programs that we like to describe as conversations that matter. So you're here for one of those, and it's great to have you with us. Today, we will be welcoming our speaker on the topic of California's Little Hoover Commission, a statewide voice for government reform. And as I have learned, the Little Hoover Commission is officially known as the Milton Marks Little Hoover Commission on California State Government Organization and Economy. That's an economical name. And maybe we'll hear more about Milton Marks today and find out where that comes from. Anyway, the board is an independent state oversight agency that evaluates the efficiency and effectiveness of California government. Through in-depth research and analysis, the Commission identifies problems, investigates programs and agencies, and makes recommendations aimed at improving the performance and accountability of state government. Our speaker will be Ethan Rarick. Am I saying that correctly?
Correct.
Thank you, Ethan. He is the Executive Director of the Little Hoover Commission. And before we hear from him, I want to just point out that we're also thankful to our co-sponsors today, the Marin County Civil Grand Jurors Association and the League of Women Voters of Marin County, both of whom have helped put this program together. So thank you to them. Lastly, our next event, before I turn this over, we are having an event on May 7. We'll have Jenny Silva, who is the Executive Director of Call Marin Home, which is a housing advocacy organization, and she will brief us on the current status of housing in Marin County and the work that her organization is doing. All right, so to get our program started, I'd like to present Kevin Haggerty, who will do our introductions. Kevin is the immediate past president of the League of Women Voters and the co-chair of the Marin Coalition, who brought you this program today. Without further ado, Kevin Haggerty.
Thank you, Scott. As Scott said, my name is Kevin Haggerty. I'm the immediate past president of the League of Women Voters. And interestingly enough, I also serve on the boards of the Marin Coalition, the Marin County Civil Grand Jury Association, and the League of Women Voters. So that's quite a group. Anyway, I wanted to, I'm here filling in for Becky Bengay, who's our current League of Women Voter president, who has the flu today and is unable to attend. But I wanted to just spend a minute or two just review, for those of you who are not familiar with the League of Women Voters, just letting you know something about them. The League of Women Voters is a nonprofit grassroots membership organization empowering everyone to fully participate in democracy through nonpartisan means. The League of Women Voters of the United States was founded in 1920 and arose from the movement that secured the women's right to vote. Men have been allowed in the organization since 1974. Although the League is nonpartisan, the League is also political. We work to improve government. We work to improve our government and engage our citizens in decisions that impact their lives. The League does not support or oppose political party or any candidate. However, we can and often take positions on initiatives and measures. How do we do this? We do it through voter education and through advocacy to declare support or opposition of issues or actions that we support. Our mission is empowering voters, defending democracy. Our vision is of a democracy where every person has the desire, the right and knowledge and the confidence to participate. The National League of Women Voter Organization includes about 750 local leagues, including leagues from every state, Washington, D.C., and the Virgin Islands. Beside the National League, we are also part of the League of Women Voters of California, the League of Women Voters of the Bay Area, and as members of the Marin League, we are part of those two organizations. Our league, the Marin League, has over 300 members, including students. In addition to our governing structure, we also have We have a voter service committee that has an education and outreach component. A distribution of voter registration forms, the pros and cons committee for state propositions. And we also put on forms of local candidates. And we also have a voter guide called 411 in which you can get information about candidates. We also, and this is something that most people don't realize, beside our efforts to educate and advocate, we also have program advocacy committees, which includes education in libraries, justice, transportation, land use, and housing, in which we study issues and develop recommendations. I would invite you to, if you're not a member, to invite you to consider becoming a member. I put some brochures on the table, and there's also some brochures back there at the table in front of the window. So please take a look at the brochures, and I'll be available. Please come see me if you have any questions regarding the league. So it's now my privilege to introduce Spencer Silas, who's our co-sponsor today. Spencer is the president of the league, is the president of the Marin County Civil Grand Jury Association. Spencer.
Thank you, Kevin. I have a brochure that I'm going to wave around too momentarily. I want to thank you all for your interest and your attendance in what I think is going to be a very interesting discussion here. Before introducing our speaker, I want to make a few remarks about, first of all, thanking my co-sponsors, the Marin Coalition and the League of Women Voters. It was an idea of bringing nonpartisan groups together and hopefully assembling some constituencies that would be interested in this particular topic. This is a first for the Marin chapter of the Civil Grand Jurors Association, which initiated the idea of this co-sponsored event. We, as a chapter, are a non-profit, nonpartisan organization comprised of former Marin Civil Grand Jurors. Our principal mission is to help recruit, select, and train Marin's Civil Grand Jurors. In fact, we're now recruiting applicants for the 2026-27 term of the Marin Civil Grand Jury, and we're hoping that some of you here today will consider applying for it. Let me ask here, by a show of hands, how many people here have served on the Marin Civil Grand Jury? We're doing pretty well here. That's about 40%. I'm looking for 100% participation on the Marin Civil Grand Jury, and we're going to give you ample opportunity to become a part of it. We have a brochure that talks about this really important service. It's back there on the table. It includes a way to get an application, and you can apply online. So you can learn a lot about it. And this is a nice timing. The deadline for applying for the jury is April 15th. So you'll have 2 weeks to consider how you're going to spend the next year of your life. So anyway, please consider doing it. For those who don't know it, the Civil Grand Jury is actually an independent citizens watchdog agency, and it watches over Marin County's local governments. Does anybody quickly want to tell me how many local governments we have in Marin County?
Dozens.
127. So yes, there are 127 different local governments operating in Marin County. And you're going to hear more about the Civil Grand Jury a bit from today's speaker, Ethan Rarick, who serves as Executive Director of the Little Hoover Commission, which in many ways is the state equivalent of a county civil grand jury. And I'll let Ethan explain that further after I've given you a taste of his impressive background. Mr. Rarick joined the Little Hoover Commission in 2019, and as Executive Director, he supports an independent citizens body that makes recommendations to the governor and legislature about improving state government. He oversees the production of in-depth studies and the publication of commission findings and the commission's efforts to support implementation of its recommendations on improving the operations of state government. Before joining the Little Hoover Commission, Mr. Rarick worked at UC Berkeley, where he was director of the Robert T. Matsui Center for Politics and Public Service and assistant director of the Institute of Governmental Studies. He was also served as a lecturer in the Department of Political Science and as a managing editor of the California Journal of Politics and Policy. Prior to joining UC Berkeley, Mr. Rarick served as a journalist reporting on politics in California and Oregon. He has written or edited 6 books on California history, and they include California Rising, The Life and Times of Pat Brown, and Governing California, Politics, Government, and Public Policy in the Golden State. He's also done a nice piece on the Donner Party, which would give you another perspective on that. So please welcome me in joining Ethan Rarick.
I promise not to talk about the Donner Party today. So, thank you very much, Spencer. Thank you to the League of Women Voters and the Marin Coalition. I have to admit I did not know the Marin Coalition until today, but I learned about it earlier, and it sounds like a great organization. So thank you all for having me. Assuming I can stop my papers from sliding away here. So I want to talk a little bit about tell you about the Little Hoover Commission first. I'll tell you about what we do, how we do it, and then I'll talk a little bit about, since Spencer did mention the comparisons that often get made between our commission and the grand juries, and we have a bunch of grand jury members. I'll talk a little bit about ways in which we are similar to civil grand juries and different from civil grand juries, and then I hope to move through that fairly quickly and then take your questions and comments. And I enjoy doing these because I always learn a lot, and so I look forward to hearing from you. So let me tell you first about the commission. You heard we have this horrible name. I think we should make state government more efficient by shortening our name. But the Milton Marks Little Hoover Commission on State Government, Organization, and Economy. So in the late 40s and early 50s, there were 2 federal commissions on reform of the federal government. The first created by President Truman, the second created by Congress. Both were headed by former President Herbert Hoover, and those became known as the Hoover Commissions in that day. And many states created their analogous versions of these Hoover Commissions, commissions on governmental efficiency, on reform of government, and those became known as Little Hoover Commissions. And there were a whole bunch of them. Most states, however, those were temporary. They existed for a year or 2 and then they went away. California kind of thought of itself as a country even then, and so California created ours as a permanent body. So it continues to exist. It's existed now for 60-odd years. The Milton Marks name, some of you may remember Milton Marks represented Marin County. Sure. The Milton Marks name was associated with it because when he introduced the bill to create the Little Hoover Commission, the state's Hoover Commission, and then subsequently, I think it was after Milton was out of the legislature, I believe, that Michael, it was after, when he was still in the legislature, that they named the commission after him. So he often gets kind of ignored because everybody knows us as the Little Hoover Commission, but they added the Milton Marks name years later. So I first came to the legislature in about 1995, and Milton Marks was still in the legislature then, so I actually knew him a little bit. Served a long time and was a very nice man. So we are a 13-member commission. 9 are public members, 4 are sitting legislators at any one time. Of the 13 members, 5 are appointed by the governor, 4 by the Speaker of the Assembly, and 4 technically by the Senate Rules Committee. That's really the President Pro Tem of the Senate. The 4 legislative members, there are always 4 sitting legislators on the commission at any one time. Those are 2 from the Senate, 2 from the Assembly. So there's 9 separate public members. We are by law bipartisan or nonpartisan, depending on what term you want to use. So what I mean by that is that by statute, of the 9 public members, no more than 5 may be registered as a member of one party. When the statute was written, they undoubtedly thought that would mean 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans, or vice versa. Today we have 4 Democrats actually, 4 NPP voters, and only 1 public member is a Republican. So in that sense, it's sort of like the state's electorate as a whole, where there are now more NPP voters than there are Republicans. Of the 4 legislative members, the 2 from the Assembly may not be members of the same party. Same for the 2 from the Senate. Since there are no independents or Green Party members or anything in the legislature, that means de facto it's 1 Democrat, 1 Republican from each of the chambers. The charge is very simple, really. It is to make recommendations to the governor and the legislature for changes in policy that will increase, in the words of the statute, economy, efficiency, or provide improved service. Particularly the last phrase means that the commission can essentially look at whatever it wants to. Improved service could be almost anything. The commission sets its own agenda, picks its own topics. We take input from all kinds of people. That's another thing that I like to get out and talk to people, because I actually hear ideas. But it's my 13 bosses, those 13 members of the commission, who decide what we're going to look at. And then we conduct the studies over the course of several months. Typically they take anywhere from maybe 3 to 6 months. Sometimes they've taken longer, sometimes a little less. They involve public hearings, a lot of staff research, both before and after the hearings. We take written comments from members of the public, from stakeholder groups. We conduct roundtables. We, in some cases, conduct site visits where commissioners actually go to a site. So the studies are fairly extensive, and then they produce written reports that include recommendations. Those recommendations every report goes to all members of the legislature and the governor. And then the commission sort of, after issuing the recommendations, moves into a kind of advocacy phase, because we support measures, whether they're administrative measures or legislation, that implement our recommendations. So we actually testify in front of the legislature. The chairman actually released a letter this morning to the governor and legislative leaders saying that the governor's new executive order on AI would implement many of our recommendations. So we do have a kind of advocacy role once the commission has made its recommendations. What kinds of topics do we look at? I actually jotted down the things we've done this morning in the last, I guess this is the last year, more or less. Just to give you a flavor, it is a very wide-ranging list of topics that we've addressed. So within the last year or so, we've done reports on the use of AI, the use of artificial intelligence. I just mentioned that in state government. We did a separate report on the use of artificial intelligence to address food insecurity or hunger, how those programs could be made more efficient. The cost of electricity in the state, how the state can work better with nonprofit agencies, the extent of the digital divide in California, i.e. Where in the state do people have widespread access to high-speed internet, where do they not, and so forth. How the state can respond to the proliferation of data centers. If you go back a little farther, we've done reports on the homeowners insurance market, on open meetings law, on the state's requirement that organic material be diverted out of landfills. We're now working right now on studies on how the state can better respond to financial scams, all of the fake phone calls and emails that you get, student debt to institutions of higher learning in the state. This is not if a student owes a Pell Grant, but rather if they owe money to UC Berkeley or to Fresno State or whatever. The management of IT projects in state government, those hearings are coming up over the next 3 months. And we're working on a report right now that reviews our own past recommendations on the state's developmental disabilities system and reviews the implementation of those, how many of those recommendations were implemented. So it is a very wide lens that the commission chooses to look at. Typically we'll issue 8 or 10 reports a year, something like that. They can be on a wide variety of topics. As the staff, we learn a lot very quickly on new topics. I want to talk a little bit about, because Spencer mentioned it, and because I am a fan of the grand jury system, and we have a lot of grand jurors here, let me just talk a little bit about the way in which the commission is often seen as a sort of statewide grand jury, and some of the similarities and differences. I have to say that I first moved to California 34 years ago from another state. And I still remember when I first got here, I was then, if you heard earlier, I was a journalist at that time. I was a newspaper reporter, and somebody said to me, this was not in Marin County, different county, but somebody said to me, the county grand jury issued a report on something, I don't know what it was, some policy issue. And I said, no. Grand juries indict people. They don't issue policy reports. What are you talking about? Well, obviously I learned that in California, grand juries are different. Grand juries do, in fact, do things like that. And over the years, I've become a huge fan of the grand jury system and the unique way that California uses civil grand juries to serve as kind of a watchdog function. What are the similarities between our commission and civil grand juries? Obviously, one is that they're both performing a watchdog function, and they're both taking advantage of kind of citizen input and perspectives. One of the things that I like in working for the commission is that our members, including the legislative members, to be honest, but especially the 9 public members, come from a wide variety of backgrounds. Right now, we have people on the commission who came out of labor organizing backgrounds, out of business backgrounds, out of civil public service backgrounds. They live all over the state, and they bring to this work their own personal perspectives. And I think that I've often seen that with grand juries as well, and I think that is an advantage of these systems that we're bringing into a kind of watchdog function. I don't know if average people is the right word, but people who have unique and different backgrounds, as we all do, and I think that really enriches this kind of work. Both our commission and the civil grand juries operate with substantial independence. Our commission, as the grand jury does, our commission sets its own agenda, decides what it wants to. The members are appointed for 4-year terms, at least initially. There's no provision for removal by the appointing authority, so our commissioners are independent and decide what to do. Both operate with substantial freedom in terms of just day-to-day operations. I think we may have more than the grand jury in some respects, but the enabling statute for our commission has very few details about exactly what we should do. We don't have to hold hearings. We don't have to do site visits. We don't have to do roundtables of stakeholders. We could do almost anything we want that reasonably fulfilled the charge to make statutory or to make recommendations for policy improvements to the governor and the legislature. Again, I think that's an advantage. I think that the fact that the legislature chooses not to tell us what to do exactly or exactly how to do it in statute allows us substantial freedom. And over the years, I've gone back, and I'm enough of a geek that I've gone back and I've read the first reports the commission did in 1962 and 63, and the way the commission operates has changed a lot over the years. So both operate with substantial freedom. Both address topics that are quite wide-ranging. You all know that grand juries address all sorts of topics. I just listed for you the topics that we've done in the last year or so. And then last, both lack the power to enforce implementation of their recommendations. That might be seen by some people as a weakness, I guess. I don't see it that way. I think what it does is in our case anyway, for the commission, and I'd be curious to know what grand jury members in the room think, but for our commission, it puts the burden on us to make the case for our recommendations as vigorously, concisely, and convincingly as possible. We're sending these reports to the 120 members of the legislature. They are very, very busy. Of course, they have big staffs, but they're very busy. And we need to, and this is something I emphasize to the staff a lot, we need to make the case for what we're recommending. If we're going to recommend X, we need to make the case succinctly, quickly, understandably, in a way that a busy legislator, I always say, imagine you're a legislative chief of staff, you have 5 minutes to look down this document. What are we going to tell that person, and how are we going to tell them in a way that they're going to take it in and say, okay, maybe we should do a bill to implement this. So the lack of enforcement, the advisory role, some people might say that's a weakness because you can't force people we can't force anybody to do anything. But I think it actually kind of makes us hone our arguments better. So I see that as a strong point. Very quickly, some brief differences between our commission and grand juries, and then I'll stop and take your questions. There's a difference in secrecy or operating behind closed doors and operating in public. Virtually everything our commission does is done in public. We're governed by the Bagley-Keene Act. Another name that Marin County people probably know is Bill Bagley. We're governed by the Bagley-Keene Act, which requires that the commission meet in public. Commissioners may not conduct what are called serial meetings, that is to say, A talks to B, talks to C, talks to D, and so forth. So pretty much everything is done in public. The topics are selected in public. Commission elects the chair and vice chair in public. The hearings are all public. Everything we do is public. Obviously, we're covered by the Public Records Act. Every email I send, I assume, is going to end up as a public record sooner or later if somebody wants it. So we operate very, very publicly. The members are chosen differently. I mentioned that our members are appointed by the governor and legislative leadership. I will be frank and say that means that although we are explicitly, as I mentioned earlier, explicitly nonpartisan or bipartisan, our commission does operate in an explicitly political environment. The governor and members of the legislature, legislative leadership are going to appoint certain kinds of people. And so that's okay. That just comes with our environment. But it is true that the appointing authorities, that there's an interest of the appointing authorities in who they put on the commission. They can't remove them, but they can decide who to put on initially. We have perhaps the biggest day-to-day function, and again, I'm curious how members of the grand jury feel about this, is I have a job because the commission has a staff. It's a very small staff. There's only 7 of us on the whole staff. But civil grand juries have no staff, as you all know. So the commission does have a staff to actually put together the hearings, do the research, write the reports. That is a difference. Those are the main differences, I think, but I don't think those differences are outweighed by the similarities. I think that when people talk about our commission as a kind of statewide grand jury, it's not exactly parallel, but it's pretty close. And as a believer in what we do, I like my job. I think we do good work, but I also love the work that grand juries do. We've used grand jury reports before as research sources. So I'm a fan of both of these kinds of institutions. Let me stop there and take questions and comments, and interested to hear what you all have to say. Hi, here we are.
Thank you. I noticed that a lot of the topics that you mentioned have to do with technology, and of course that would affect California more than probably most states, right? And there are 2 other things that jumped into my mind that affect California probably more than most other states. One is housing, and one is climate change, the wildfires, the sea level rise. So have you or will you look at either of those?
Yes. So let me say that you are correct that many of the topics I named have to do with technology. That is in part because I sort of focused on things we've done in the last year and a half. And for whatever reason, some of the commissioners who are on the commission now have an interest in technology. The spread of artificial intelligence has been something that's been sort of top of mind. I think those are good topics, but it may have skewed the lens a little bit towards the pro-technology thing. So I could have, if I go back to, I've been in this job 7 years, as I think Spencer mentioned. If I were to go back farther, we've done reports. We did a whole series of reports on how the state should respond to domestic violence, for instance. We did a series of reports on how the state should respond to human trafficking for purposes of labor exploitation. We sort of didn't focus on sexual exploitation, but instead on labor exploitation. So there have been other times where we have focused much more on sort of human services issues, if you will, and less on technology. To go to the two topics that you mentioned, we have actually addressed both of those, though we might address them again, I suppose. On housing, we did a report in 2022 that addressed housing policy. Lots of things have changed since 2022, so that was getting a little long in the tooth, if you will, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But we did do a report on housing in 2022. And then last year, the governor proposed a reorganization of state government to create a separate housing and homelessness agency to basically take, there was something called the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, and he wanted to split it in two and create one agency that would just focus on housing and homelessness, and one that is essentially does licensing, whether it's licensing beauticians or auto mechanics, or it handles all the consumer services stuff, is basically all the state licensing. When the governor proposes a reorganization, the state has a formal reorganization plan, and that the commission actually has a role in that. It's the one thing that we statutorily have to do. The commission doesn't set its own agenda on this. If the governor proposes a reorganization through that plan, there are sometimes the governor and legislature reorganize state government in other ways, using some stuff called trailer bills that are connected to the budget. But set aside that for just a moment. If the actual reorganization process is used, as it was last year, then the commission, the governor's proposal comes to us before it goes to the legislature. The commission is required to do a report that goes to the legislature recommending whether or not the governor's reorganization be approved. And then the legislature basically has 60 days after they get the plan. There's some other deadlines in there, but essentially they have 60 days after they get the plan to either they can veto the governor's reorganization proposal or they can accept it. So last year, as part of this, we got this reorg proposal. We held 2 or 3 days of hearings. I can't remember exactly which. Did a lot of research. We sort of produced in the space of about 2 to 3 months a short book on the organization of housing in different states, different countries, housing policy, et cetera, et cetera. We ultimately recommended that the legislature allow this reorganization to go forward, and the legislature did that. And so actually starting, legally speaking, the new Housing and Homelessness Agency won't exist for another 3 months. I think it's July the 1st of this year that it actually comes into being. So over the last 4 years, we have done work on housing. Just at the last meeting, which was last week actually, the commission asked us to produce what we call a scoping memo, which is basically the first step towards another study. And what they asked, one of the things they asked us to look at was how housing policy has changed since our report in 2022, and by derivation since the reorg hearings last year. And so we may very likely we're now working on that memo. That'll go to the commission. They'll decide if they want to proceed with a full study on housing policy. So we may very likely end up doing another study on housing later this year. With regard to climate change, yes, the commission probably most notably this was just before I started, so it was about 8 years ago, but the commission did a very large study on forest management and wildfires, specifically related to climate change. Many of the recommendations from that study were in fact implemented, many of them administratively by Jerry Brown was governor then. And over the years, the commission has done some other work on climate change, though that one has been a while. We've done housing more recently. So I think both of those are great topics. In particular, housing is something we've looked at in the last few years. That was a long answer, sorry.
Next question over here.
I'll try to keep them shorter from now on. Yes, sir.
I'm a little curious, have you looked into, made any recommendation to this 19th century debacle of our high-speed rail? We've got billions of dollars going nowhere, yet the government continues on this. Have you done anything looking into that?
We have not done high-speed rail. The state auditor's office has done fairly extensive work on high-speed rail, but for whatever reason, our commissioners, my 13 bosses, have not. That is not something we have done. It's the auditor's office is, to be honest, our reports are much more sort of like performance audits. So they're sort of we look at how things are done in other states or other countries, or how things have changed over time or whatever. in terms of, to be completely honest, in terms of tracking money, in terms of counting things and so forth, the state auditor's office is better at that than we are, and they have far, far more resources. We have a staff of 7. The last time I looked, I believe the state auditor has 217. So I probably say that with a little bit of jealousy, but anyway, so they have done a lot of work on that. Legislative Analyst's Office has, but we have not.
There's a question here. Sorry.
Actually, I've got 2 simple questions. The first of which is, are you subject to the Brown Act? And secondly, I guess my question really is, do you have a scorecard in being able to identify how much you actually have influenced state policy?
Let me take the first one is simpler than the second one. So the answer is no, but we are subject to, so the Bagley-Keene Act is for state agencies the equivalent of the Brown Act. The Brown Act applies only to local government, and the Bagley-Keene Act is the open meetings law for state agencies. We are subject to the Bagley-Keene Act. And it functions, it used to function almost identically to the Brown Act, if you're familiar with the Brown Act. Since the pandemic, there have been some changes, and they've diverged slightly, but not much. It's basically the same. A scorecard. This is something I nodded and smiled because we've talked about this a lot, and the answer is really no, but we're kind of working on that. We probably should have made more progress on that than we have, to be honest. The problem is that most commonly, our recommendations end up being sort of partially implemented. Sometimes they're implemented fully, 100%. Sometimes they're ignored. But what happens most of the time is the legislature implements them, but kind of does a little bit of a tweak or does something a little bit different than we want or something. And we've talked about and done a little bit of work on, but not enough, developing some attempt to really score that out in a fair way. We don't want to do it, we don't want to toot our own horn too much, but we also do want to have concrete numbers. And so that's proven to be a little bit more art than science, to tell you the truth, as to how to judge something that is, if it's implemented 50% or 70% or 30%, how do we kind of figure that out? So we're working on that. If I come back in a year or two, hopefully I can give you a better, there's another state commission, for instance, called the Law Revision Commission. They only look at revisions to state statutes. They're a bunch of lawyers and they do very particular kind of work. They can score it out very, very well, and we need to develop something like that. The other thing I will say is that there can be issues of, and again, we've tried to be fair about this. To be honest, a good idea sometimes is, what's the old saying, success has many fathers, failure is an orphan. There can be 3 or 4 people who suggest the same idea more or less at kind of the same time. And so if we make a recommendation and somebody in the legislature has the same idea, and maybe the LAO, the Legislative Analyst's Office, has recommended the same thing or something, how much is that our achievement versus sort of we're working in concert with people? Again, we don't have a good measurement of that. But it's a very good question. Yeah.
So civil grand juries don't have to worry about the Brown Act. We perform in secret.
Correct.
You have to operate in public.
Correct.
Do you find that there are circumstances where you'll start looking into something that everybody knows you're looking into, and you get a little message saying, leave that alone?
No, we don't get a message saying leave that alone. For one thing, no one appointing authority appoints a majority of the commission. So the governor appoints 5 of the 13, the assembly appoints 4, the senate appoints 4. What I will say is that we do frequently, state agencies do not always like that we are looking at them, or they do not always like our reports. I guess they say, leave that. Maybe I have to amend my statement. So they would love it if we left it alone, but we don't. So let me give you just a very concrete example. I mentioned this report earlier. State has a program that would require, if it were fully implemented, which it's not, would require that most organic material be diverted out of landfills, because when organic material, this is food waste and the like, goes into landfills, it puts off methane, which is a horrible contributor to climate change. So the state has these requirements that X percentage by they're ramping up it's X percentage by 2030 and Y percentage by 2040 and so forth to divert organic material out of landfill. We did a report on this about 3 years ago and found that the state was way short of its targets. There was no practical, there was no way they were going to make those targets. And the program was just not working. And we recommended some specific changes that we think would help it work better, and some of those have been adopted by the legislature, some have not been. The then director of the Department of Cal Recycle would have run me over with a car if she could have. She was furious. She testified before the commission, complaining about our draft staff report. She made public comment, urging the commission to reject the report. She was irate. And so we do run into that. We just held a hearing recently. I mentioned the student debt to institutions of higher learning. The UC and CSU systems weren't irate. That would be unfair, but they were not thrilled that we were looking at that, because the issue is, should they forgive students this debt? Should they use collection agencies, which they do? Is that too hard on the students? Should they allow the students to re-enroll, et cetera, et cetera? And their view was, leave us alone. We'll take care of this. So we get pushback from state agencies, but nobody, in my experience, nobody has at least successfully said leave that alone.
You mentioned that the appointments are for 4 years, and I'm curious about what happens after that. Or is it typical that they re-up for another period of time, and then do the members really become sort of ingrained staff in the freshness may?
Members are subject to reappointment. They can be reappointed repeatedly. There is a state law, a provision of the government code that says if you are, for any officer of state government, after the expiration of a term, you remain in office until your successor has been confirmed, or been appointed, or I don't know what, can't remember the word. But anyway, so to be blunt, what Governor Newsom has done is appoint people for 4-year periods and then leave them on using that statute without reappointing for another 4-year term. But to be honest, this gives him the opportunity, if he wishes, to replace somebody after, in other words, so he didn't appoint me, I'm not a member of the commission, but if I were, he appoints me for a 4-year term, I then stay on for another year, and he doesn't have to reappoint me for another 4-year term. He can say, I'm going to fill that seat with somebody new after the 5th year, if you see what I'm saying. So that's been a change that it had happened somewhat in the past, but it's happened even more now. So they can be reappointed for full 4-year terms. Some appointing authorities do that. Some just leave them on after the initial term, but the initial term is always 4 years. Many of them stay on for long periods of time. Do they become, I think you said, ingrained staff? They don't become staff. They do develop real expertise in certain areas. To go back to technology, depending on how you want to count, sort of 2.5 of the commissioners have a real interest in technology and public policy around technology, and they've been around now for multiple studies on those kinds of topics, and so they do develop some real expertise. But, and some of them stay on for years. I don't know, does that answer your question?
It does. I was concerned about a lack of freshness, that they become these political appointees and lose their freshness after a while in terms of ideas and willingness to maybe go after certain topics.
I haven't, in my 7 years with the commission, I haven't seen, there's been substantial turnover. Others, I'm trying to think of the legislative members turn over pretty often, actually. The 9 public members, I believe there are 3 who were on when I took the job 7 years ago. So 6 of those 9 have turned over. A couple of those seats have turned over a couple of times. I haven't really, I will say that maybe this is, I'm talking about my own bosses here, but the commissioners are very dedicated to what we do. And so I haven't seen a lack of freshness as a problem. We send them packets of material before every meeting that can range from 70, 80 pages of background material up to 300 pages, and they actually read them very carefully. There's one commissioner who is notorious on the commission for reading all footnotes. If there's a mistake on footnote 62, he will call me up and say there's an error in footnote 62. So they're very committed.
Thank you. The state housing mandate legislation seems on a collision course for failure because housing is not being built. I'm curious whether the Little Hoover Commission is looking at that in any way. Can you be in a position to make a recommendation for modifications in that? Second question.
Can I just clarify? You're talking about the RENA process?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay, yeah.
Second of all, different, but local officials are required to respond to grand jury reports by law.
Sure.
Is there a required response to a Little Hoover Commission report? And lastly, there's 3 questions here. Who hires you?
I'll take those in reverse order because the last one is the simplest. I'm hired by the commission as a whole. So I report to the commission. The rest of the staff reports to me. I report to the commission. If the commission wanted to fire me, they would have to it would take a vote of the full commission. The second question, yes, that is a difference I didn't mention earlier. There is a required response for grand juries. There is not for us. State agencies can completely ignore us if they want. They don't generally. We don't include a response like the state auditor. When they do an audit of a state agency, they actually include a written response from that agency in the report. We do not do that, but state agencies generally do respond in one way or another, sometimes publicly, sometimes privately. It can vary a lot. And I think they do that in part because they know that all of our reports go to all members of the legislature. The legislature tends to be very receptive to our reports. To be honest, we're a source of bill ideas for them. So they say, let's do a bill that would implement this recommendation. And the state agencies are aware of that. And even if they don't like our reports, they know that they may very likely lead to a bill. And so they're going to respond in some way. The RENA process, you're going to make me go back to 2022. I think some of the recommendations in our 2022 housing report did recommend some changes to the RENA process. I can't recall them off the top of my head specifically. I mentioned that we may be doing another housing report in the coming months or a year or something like that. I wouldn't dare prejudge what we will look at because that's really for the commissioners to decide or what they would ultimately recommend. But certainly, the commissioners are aware of the controversies surrounding the RENA process. Let me put it that way.
Okay, Ethan has about 7 minutes, so we'll try and whip through a few more questions.
Well, I hate to run off. Maybe I can stay a little longer. I didn't realize that. Anyway, go ahead.
First of all, thank you for coming down to Marin and giving us this very valuable information. Everything you said is wonderful, except for the part where you called grand jurors probably average. I'm not a grand.
Yeah, well, I said average is the wrong word.
The level of expertise.
Yeah, I should have said real people.
Really committed, geeky, smarty pants real people. Okay.
Yeah.
But I'm not one of them, but I know what work it is. I became aware of Little Hoover working alongside, not at Little Hoover, but when he left, your predecessor, Jim Mayer, who also was also a journalist, so he knew government inside out and communicated well. So I'd love to see that continue. You are responding, my question is about the governmental organizational piece. So you are required to respond to reorganization recommendations, and you're proactively at the issue or topic area initiating things. But I can imagine that you're going to find, as you know all these state agencies, there's duplication, there's gaps, Or another challenge is when state agencies are handing things off to counties. So it's sort of the larger meta-organizational thing. Do you ever initiate, larger suggestions at the organizational level rather than just respond to someone else's reorg idea?
Well, yes, the commission very often has in the reports that the commission decides to do, very often we recommend organizational changes, appointment of creation of new leadership positions. We've recommended creation of entirely new agencies, moving units with this. We'll say move this unit over to that department or something like that. So yes, we frequently do that. The difference is those are topics that the commission is picking itself, whereas the part that we're required to do is when the governor proposes a reorganization, we're required to produce a report to the legislature that assesses that reorganization. So the difference is between.
But I understand that, but if you have this expertise, you could be making even more broad-scale recommendations to improve the overall structure, and maybe you're able to do that in a way that someone inside an agency isn't going to say, you know what, my agency's redundant, I'm going to just bow out.
Well, we do, I mean, the commission has many, many times proposed moving components of state government, closing certain offices, creating new offices, and so over the years, that's happened many times. In fact, I think it would be an unusual report that probably didn't include at least one recommendation that in one way or another referenced organization. And actually, if you know state government, it sounds like you do, right now in California, there are state departments, and then there are sort of umbrella organizations called state agencies, and then those are headed by a secretary that reports to the governor. And so that system, whether or not that system is good, is up to people can decide. But that system actually was created in 1966 or something like that after a recommendation from the commission. The commission recommended grouping departments into agencies and creating these overarching agencies. This is a long, long time ago. But so yes, the answer is that we have made many organizational recommendations. Yeah.
Spencer asked partly what I was going to ask, but really didn't. He's my husband, so I didn't ask it fulsomely enough. So you said that I was curious in the responses. And in the counties, the agencies are required to respond to the reports. And you said they're not required, but they often do. So my question is, two questions. The easy one is, when they do respond, is that made public? Because it would be great to see what they're saying in response to your recommendation. The second question, that's the easy part. The second question is about recommendations, because you're working for this commission, but can recommendations for things to study for projects you come from anywhere, or are you dependent on what that commission comes up with? Thanks.
So the first question is the response public? Yes, usually. So the response might come in many forms. It might come in the form of a letter to the commission, which we would put on our website, and so it would become public in that sense. Even if we didn't put it on the website, it would be public. It's subject to a Public Records Act if somebody wants to. And we have had Public Records Act requests. We did a study of CEQA a few years ago, and a law firm that does a lot of CEQA work PRA'd us for all public comment we had received. So we do get things like that. So in other cases, the response from a state agency might come, let's say that somebody, I mentioned dispensers, somebody in the legislature introduces a bill that would implement one of our recommendations. The state agency then is going to be asked by the legislature, what do you think of this bill? Or they're going to take a position, or they're going to be asked to testify, or whatever. It might come in the form of, it can come in the form of public comment. I mentioned the head of Cal Recycle calling up and complaining about a report. So generally, yes, it would become public because there's virtually nothing we do that remains private, really. And I'm sorry, remind me of your second question.
Where the topics-
Oh, topics everywhere. Topics come from everywhere. We take suggestions, we get suggestions from members of the public, from stakeholder groups, from members of the legislature. We're not obligated to do what the legislature wants us to, but the legislature, increasingly now, legislators write us letters and say, please study this or that. So lots of different places. I am sort of the funnel point at which I take all of those recommendations and then boil them down to a list of kind of potential topics, which is quite long. It has dozens of potential topics. And the way the process works is then I go to the commission and I say, we have staff bandwidth to add one more topic or two more topics, so now you can pick. They then discuss that, using that list as kind of a guide, but they're free to go off that list, and they have sometimes. Sometimes they've picked something that I didn't see coming at all. We are not bound. The ideas come from everywhere. At the end of the day, what we do studies on, that's determined by the commission. That's not my determination as staff or anybody else. That's the commission.
That was actually my question.
All right. Let's move over here. Probably got time for one or two more.
So you mentioned about doing some studies on debt, student debt.
Correct.
And I'm wondering about impacts from the federal government. So for example, with student debt, the federal government decisions to fund, anyway, I'm just wondering how that impacts the studies that you do, and that also when it comes to, say, voting. How do you might come up with a study, and then the federal government is saying, has something going on that impacts the state of California, which completely would change what you wrote about.
Correct. Well, we would, if such a thing happened while the study was going on, we would take that into account when we wrote the report, and the commissioners could consider the ways in which federal action is impacting the state. To be honest, once the reports are issued, if there's some subsequent federal action, we don't go back and, occasionally we do go back and update the reports if the commission wants us to, but there's no automatic process that does that. So the reports are released and they exist, and there's a set of recommendations, and sometimes those recommendations are still valid years later, and sometimes things change, and to be honest, the recommendations, that doesn't happen too often, but sometimes they become less relevant over the course of time due to federal action or something else, any number of things. So with regard to the student debt issue, that was a study requested by a member of the legislature, and that was focused specifically on debt that students owe to the institutions they are attending. So that's not, again, things like a Pell Grant or things like that. The only exception to that is, I didn't know this until we did this study, if a student drops out of, let's say they're going to Cal, and they drop out in the middle of the term, and they had a Pell Grant, let's say, or some other form of federal aid, depending on some specifics, has to be before 60% of the term and blah, blah, blah. But depending on some specifics, the federal government demands that the institution pay back the Pell Grant. The federal government takes back the money from the institution, and then the institution turns around, Cal will turn around and say, now, student Jane Jones, you owe us the Pell Grant. You thought it was just a grant when you got it. Now it's a debt that you owe to UC Berkeley or whatever school it is. So, but other than that, that student debt study isn't impacted by other changes to federal student aid. I don't know, does that answer your question? I don't know if I'm getting at what you're asking.
Well, it was an interesting answer.
All right, we'll have to make this our last one.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Ethan, thanks for coming. Just as an aside, his book on Pat Brown, biography of Pat Brown, is a favorite of mine and lots of people. And
Thank you.
if you want to study a good story of California history, especially in that era that some of us recall personally. It's a great book. It's a good story of San Francisco, San Quentin, and a variety of other things in there. I just want to know where are the shortcomings of the Little Hoover Commission? And compare those shortcomings to the shortcomings of the grand jury.
Well, the second part I don't know that I can do, because I know some about grand juries, but not as much. So I probably won't. I don't know that I can do the second part. But it's a great question about what are the shortcomings of the commission. The biggest shortcoming, I think, is that we do so many different topics, and we are generalists. And I mentioned that as staff and as commissioners, we learn a lot very quickly. But if we had, and I don't want this answer to just be interpreted as the state should give us more money and we had a bigger staff and so forth. But if we had a bigger staff and we could develop deep issue expertise at the staff level, I think that would really strengthen our work, and we could come back to things more often and so forth. Right now, we don't really do that. We do what the commission wants us to do, and I think we do a good job, but I think that that's a problem. The other biggest shortcoming is the commission has long been focused much more on producing its reports than on all of the implementation work that comes afterwards. And this goes to that gentleman's question about having a good scoring system for what have we really changed. It goes to all of the work that I mentioned earlier about kind of now we've done some work on this. Every study is accompanied by a webinar for legislative staff. It's accompanied by an op-ed. We send a letter to the governor this morning saying your executive order implements some of our stuff. That's good. So we do more work on implementation than we have in the past. But I think the other big shortcoming I would say is just because the reports are the product of the commission, and they're kind of what the commission has always thought of itself as doing, we're much better at doing the research, the reports, at making the recommendations, and we haven't done as good a job as we could have or should have on the second half, which is really, to be honest, working with the legislature largely to really see that those are implemented. We're getting better at that. Next week I testify on 2 bills that we're supporting in the legislature, so we're having more and more interaction with the legislature, and we're getting better, but I think that's the thing that we really need to improve on.
Would you like more teeth?
I don't know that I would like more staff. I would like more resources. I would like more people. Whether we should or shouldn't have teeth is really a policymaker decision that the legislature should decide. And so that's a value judgment that, I think I'll leave to the legislature.
All right, I'm just going to slide in one last question. Is it true that the Milton Marks Little Hoover Commission is going to change its name to the Donald Trump and Milton Marks Hoover Commission?
I doubt that will be the case.
Okay. I actually did not read that. Hey, I have to thank Ethan for an amazing presentation. Let's hear it.
Thank you.
Obviously, we had a very interested crowd, and I think they got what they came for, so thank you. I want to thank the Civil Grand Jury Association as well as the League of Women Voters for helping to put this together. Thanks to Kevin for programming this. Thanks to Alan for all of our technical work, and thanks to all of you for coming. We'll see you next time, I hope.
Thank you very much.